How to develop GraphQL APIs locally using StepZen. In this video, I'll be showing you how to set up a GraphQL API with StepZen for a MySQL database that runs locally with Docker. And for this entire video, we'll be using just Docker, so you can run StepZen locally without having to deploy it to the cloud yet. Because the nice thing is, at StepZen we build a CLI that's very powerful to help you deploy your GraphQL APIs to the cloud. But sometimes you just want to start locally by developing it on your machine before bringing it to the cloud, because maybe your database is still in your local machine, or maybe you're not working with a database, but with a REST API or any other REST API that you are building locally on your machine. So by using StepZen via Docker, you can actually start building GraphQL APIs for these locally running data sources. So let's dive in. Of course, you need to have Docker installed on your machine, because we will be using Docker. As you can see, I don't have any containers running just yet. And then we'll be using StepZen for local development, as you can see in our documentation, and this link will be available in the description of this video. And of course, I've set up a local VS Code project. And in here I have a Docker Compose file to create a MySQL database that will be running locally on my machine. So, of course, I need to have the StepZen CLI installed, which I already did. And then the command will be running StepZen service start. So this will start the StepZen service locally, directly on your machine. It will start pulling a StepZen Docker file from a Docker directory. It will create a locally running database. That's a Postgres database actually, that we will be using to store any account metadata that's used to run StepZen locally. And then of course it will start the container to run StepZen local on your machine. So this will be two things, StepZen local, which is the StepZen service, and then StepZen metadata, which is the metadata that is available for the locally running StepZen. And once these things have been started, you can also find them in Docker. I typically use Docker Desktop because it's a nice way to view all the Docker containers available on your machine. I would be going here. In a couple of seconds, you can see StepZen metadata and StepZen local both running. So we have a Postgres database, and then we have a Docker image that runs StepZen's local service. So if we go back to VS Code, we can see that StepZen has finished setting up these Docker containers, and we were able to start StepZen service. Of course, we will need to set some sort of login. So we will be pointing this login to a local YAML file, after which we should be able to use StepZen service normally the same way as you would do through the CLI. So we've now successfully logged in with a local account, which is called GraphQL. And now we are able to import data sources. It can be a REST API, it can be a GraphQL API, or a MySQL database, as we'll be doing in this tutorial. For this, first let's start the MySQL database, and I have a Docker Compose file. So the only thing I need to do is run Docker Compose up, and then this will start the MySQL database. You can see it uses a init.sql file, which is right here. And from here you can see the data that will be added. So it's address, customer address, and some other data as well. Of course, it will also seed the database with these values. With going back to Docker Desktop, you can see a third container is now running, which is the MySQL database. Going back to VS Code, the final step to set this up is importing the MySQL database. And we can do this just by running StepZen import, small typo there, StepZen import MySQL. The first question is, what is actually the host of your database? But actually it won't be the first question. The first question it will ask you is, how would you like to name your endpoint? Because of course you need to set a name for your GraphQL endpoint, otherwise you wouldn't know where to put it. There is an auto suggestion, but typically I'd like to rename it to something that's a bit more like the data source I'm importing. So we need to set the host address, which is host.docker.internal. Then we need to set the database name, which actually we can all find this information in Docker Compose file. So database name is introspection. Let me just copy paste these. Then we have the user, which is test user introspection. And then we need to set the password, which is hurricane blah 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 blah. And then the CLI asked me actually the most important question today. It is, do you want to automatically link types based on foreign key constraints? And of course we need to say yes, because this means that StepZen will create relationships between tables that have a foreign key relation. Which is something you want because it makes your schema way more advanced. And now StepZen will start introspecting the local MySQL database. It will send an introspection request to it. It will transform the tables and all the columns in the tables into a GraphQL schema, and then makes it possible for you to run that schema locally on your machine. So it looks like it's taking a bit more time than usual, probably because my computer is having a hard time helping me run all these Docker containers. And now you can see the MySQL thing has been created. You can see we have all these GraphQL types. And then if we go to the bottom, we can see we have operations and mutations. And it's a combination of both declarative and also a bit more imperative, where you can actually see the raw queries. And if you'd like to know more about how StepZen uses SQL, I will put a blog post link in the description of this video. So now we have our setup. The next step is to actually run it. We can see we have our config YAML file that points towards the local Docker. And then the next step is run StepZen start. So this will start the StepZen GraphQL API on the locally running StepZen with Docker. It will take a connection string to our database that also runs locally, and then deploys these files also to your machine because it runs locally with Docker. In the CLI we can see some example query, so we can either use curl to curl the local running StepZen API, or we can also use a graphical, which also runs locally, of course. If I go back to my browser, you can see I already have this tab opened for us. Just probably need to refresh this page, so I can get a fresh graphical. And this graphical will be connected to the local GraphQL API with StepZen that takes data from our local MySQL database. So while this is loading, let me explain to you again what the flow would look like. So you would set up StepZen locally using the CLI in our Docker container. You would point it towards a local or even a remote data source. And then you run StepZen start, which will run StepZen locally on your machine with the schema that you just created using the local data sources or even remote data sources. And then I can, for example, use this to get a list of addresses. I can also use it to get a single address, to get customers with relational tables like addresses. So basically everything you can do with the StepZen CLI, you can do now locally using Docker. The only downside is, if you want to make this Docker available to the outside world, you will need to deploy it to the cloud or even to your own private cloud. So if these are things you like, make sure to find all the links in the description and reach out to us if you need any help deploying this. And with this, I will be ending this video. If you like it, press that like button below. Also, follow us on Twitter or subscribe to our YouTube channel, because we will be posting regular videos about cool things you can do with GraphQL.